She woke in the dead of night, unsure if she'd succeed, fail, or die. Because the last person to attempt what she was doing did die. And soon Melissa Arnot would be walking right past one of Everest's most infamous bodies, Sleeping Beauty. In 1998, Francys Arsentiev became the first American woman to summit Everest without bottled oxygen, but she never made it down. Too exhausted to take another step, her husband and climbing partner, Sergei, vanished trying to save her. 6 years before that night, Melissa Arnot did attempt to try climbing without bottled oxygen, and she failed. She reached for a bottle of oxygen, but she would not go down without a fight. She had already climbed Mount Everest 5 times with oxygen, nothing to prove, but deep inside there was that lingering doubt, something that drove her to go the next step, to prove herself among the elites of all of mountaineering, not just the women, but the men, the guides that still dominate the sport to this day. This time in 2016, she eliminated the temptation to reach for the oxygen because she literally did not bring any. It was either fail or succeed and possibly die trying. Melissa went dark on social media. She didn't let anybody know what she was attempting to do. She had her partner with her, Tyler Reid, and he would propose marriage to her, still in the death zone on the descent from succeeding. She became one of the elite few mountaineers. Only 200 or so have done so, and only a small handful of women have joined the ranks of the great climbs of Mount Everest, and Melissa was now part of that. Melissa Arnot Reid's story isn't just about becoming a great woman mountaineer. It's about becoming one of the best, period. She spent her life, her early years, chasing something, pushing herself to prove to her family, to the world, and to the mountaineering and guiding industry in particular, and maybe most of all, to herself, that she was enough, that she already had that within her and had nothing to prove. And that is the title of Melissa's new book, released on April 1st, 2025, her memoir, Enough: Climbing Toward a True Self on Mount Everest. I had the pleasure of reading that book before its release and did an amazing interview with Melissa. I've known her since 2009 on an expedition up Aconcagua, where she was a brand ambassador for a very well-known outdoor brand. And I'm going to bring that interview to you today, Melissa Arnot Reid. For the full expanded interview, I'll put a link to my podcast, The Happiness Quotient. Here I'm bringing you highlights, the Everest-centric element and part of her early childhood experiences that made her what she is today, so she can talk about the courage it took for what she says is not a book about Mount Everest. And believe me, that was a great relief. I've read many Mount Everest books, and they become quite tedious, to be honest, and Melissa's stands out as something completely different, while for true Everest buffs, you get all the Everest you could possibly need, but a lot more. The book is a soul journey about captivity, about rising through the ranks in a man's world, about liberation. What was it like for a young woman, obviously very talented, to look up to these gods, if you will, the men who had dominated the guiding industry, put up on pedestals? As one of Melissa's chapters toward the end says, all that glitters is not gold. We're not going to name any names in this interview today, but if you read Melissa Arnot's book, she does not take any prisoners. She goes right out there and speaks her truth about her experiences and how it was to try to get into that elite crowd of some of the great guides of our era. Let's get into that interview with Melissa Arnot Reid. Again, the full interview will be on my podcast, The Happiness Quotient. Check in the description below for the link to that. Here's my interview with Melissa Arnot Reid from her home. Melissa, honestly, I texted you the other day, told you that I didn't want to tell you what I thought about the book too much. I just wanted to save it but it blew my mind. I was really excited because, as you said, when you sent it to me and texting, it's not what you think. It's not the book you might think it's going to be. Tell me about that process of writing it, because it must have been quite an emotional journey for you to dive deeply into that.
Yeah, forever, I'll kind of start at near the end. When I sold the book to the publisher, it was under this file name of "This is not a book about Everest." And I felt like I had to constantly quantify, like, I wrote a book, but it's not a book about Everest. And so, to then leap backwards in the process of writing, I had been approached many times in my early career of, oh, do you want to write a book? Like, and especially after 2016, Summiting without oxygen, there was this possibility that I could write a story of succeeding after failure, and, just a really perfectly fine and limited book about the process of climbing. And I felt in my heart that I didn't want to do that. My life is not Mount Everest. That's a part of my life, but my life started far before that. And, I have been through some really challenging things, some that weren't, I had nothing to do with, no choice in, and some that I self-created, some really big obstacles for myself. And it has always felt imperative to me when I stand on, a public speaking stage, or when I stand on the internet and I share my stories of success, that I also give the context to people that, it's not a summit photo. Life is really complicated, and there's so much that goes into what gets you there. And I've never had a medium where I could take the time to explain it. And this book is mine. I've worked with a lot of brands over the years, and my image has been a little bit owned by other people. And I haven't had the luxury of telling my full own story, but in my book, I have that luxury, and I took it, and I took some pretty big risks. I mean, this book is, there's going to be some people that are not going to come on the journey with me through this next phase. And I have to think that they're not the people I want, and those risks of speaking my truth, it comes with risks.
Getting into, and I want to talk about your childhood a little bit,
Yeah.
but entering into still a man's world in
Hmm.
the realm of mountaineering, but especially in the realm of guiding, and kind of
Hmm.
cracking into that and facing just the so almost cliche, like a TV
Yeah.
movie or something, of how hard it is for a woman to actually be respected and appreciated for her talents and not looked at like a woman,
Hmm.
or that she got there because of a relationship she was in with somebody who was already there. You were a realist about it. You were willing to play the game, but
Yep.
also not take any shit from anybody at the same time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that felt really essential to share with the world, is this idea that is known, which is like, this is a man's world, and it's so hard to receive respect. And there's assumptions as a conventionally attractive woman in this very male-dominated space about your usefulness in this place and why you might be there. And also, that's part of why I was there. I had this constant voice deep inside of me that said to only myself, do the best job you can do. And that way, when you go to sleep at night, when you look at your face in the morning in the mirror, you can know that you're doing the best you can, regardless of the other factors. So if you are truly doing your best and you're there, then you deserve to be there. But of course, there was this other thing going on for me, which is like leveraging the, access that I had via the, no offense, but like the simple minds of men and in this space. And I was really aware of it really early in my career. And, I think it's looked down upon, if you are a woman who takes advantage of that. And I sort of went in and, I go into it in the book in quite a lot of detail, but I I wanted to get some power back, and it was really complicated for me to work through that. And really, like, sitting here today and writing this book, there's a lot of that I don't feel proud of. I'm not like, it's not a manual on how to move through a man's world. It's really, there's things I'm like, I could go back and just shake younger Melissa and be like, girl, don't do that. Like, you don't have to do that. But at the same time, I didn't know what else to do. I was really trying everything. I was really thoughtful about how I chose to talk about people and really careful that I was not being intentionally trying to harm somebody, sharing something that was intentionally harming, but really trying to also tell the truth. And, I've had a reaction, from somebody reading the book who knew a character in the book and said, what do you think so-and-so is going to think about that? And my answer, and this is a little bit of I apologize for this sentiment, but my answer is they know what I didn't write. I wrote a lot, but the person who you might be concerned about of like, oh, what does he think of? He knows what I didn't say. And you don't, but he does. And if he's not, I'm okay, because honestly, in one of the chapters, I talk about how I was on Everest. I was working with a very experienced guide, and there was a battle of egos going on with my ego and wanting this respect and feeling I had done a lot to deserve respect and not feeling that I was getting it. And we were in this sort of challenge, and it was so frustrating. And I hung up a piece of white printer paper with the Abraham Lincoln quote in the middle of our dining tent that said, nearly any man can withstand adversity. If you want to test a man's character, give him power. And I just wanted to say that to the guides that I was working with, that I felt like, I was like, your character is showing in your power, because you're holding me down to prove what? Like, you don't have any sense of how hard it is for me to even be here. Like, you don't have any sense of what I've had to do to even stand in this role, and then you're putting your thumb on me. Like, you already have so much more than I do. Why do you need to hold me down? And I couldn't articulate it at that time, but I was just this deep sense of frustration of, it is so impossible, in my experience, and I can't speak for everybody, but I will say in my experience, it often felt impossible to walk the line of being both, one of the guys enough that you were let into the club, but not so much that there was more expected of you because you were there, and this line of walking was in direct conflict with this thing that I cared deeply about, which was my craft in the mountains. And, I have a deep connection to my soul in the mountains, and the sense of freedom and the sense of humility that I've received from that, and the sense of, deep belonging that I feel from nature. And I think a lot of people can understand those feelings, but it's life-saving for me. And I knew I wanted to make my life in the mountains, but then realizing that I had to sort of don the costume of man to be able to be there was often a very frustrating dynamic.
So in that, and we don't have to expand too broadly on it, but your childhood sounded really interesting. You had an interesting family dynamic with your mom and your dad and your sister being involved in there.
Yeah.
And to me, in all that, and I'd like you to incorporate that into what really blew my mind, was how much a person in position of power completely took advantage of you, but damn near destroyed your life. And in a person in complete authority, and I could see it coming. An officer comes in the DARE program.
When I stand on a stage at a speaking event, I often show this picture of, my very quintessentially hippie father with his long beard, and I'm a baby, and he's kind of got his bloodshot eyes leaning back, and he's holding the baby, and the baby's got a ball cap. And I make a joke of I grew up with authentically hippie parents, and everybody laughs. And, that was true. My parents were authentic hippies. My dad detested the idea of working for the man. My mom was a housewife who was really struggling with some mental health issues that I think she was not capable of even being aware of in many ways, and struggling to raise kids. And there, it created a tense dynamic for me and my sister. And we had, one parent who was really easygoing and one parent who was really rigid. And, all people in families, we all know it's complicated how you grow up. But, my parents were pot smoking hippies that crawled out of the 70s and had a little family and, lived in a trailer and tried to make it work. And I had some interesting feelings of whether or not I belonged fully in that family. And I go into it with this really complicated relationship with my mother from birth. And that was a seed that then by the time I was, I grew up just outside of the Southern Ute Indian Reservation in Southern Colorado. And we had a really aggressive DARE program on the reservation. And in my 6th grade year, we had a new young DARE officer who came to the school, and he was a predator. And he began the process of grooming me and taking me first just out of class and giving me attention and time and love that I was like actually deeply craving, and then started to weaponize the things I shared with him about my family. And ultimately, I, you know, I have a conflicted relationship with it, honestly, still today, because in so many ways, I feel that I betrayed my family. And I also know that I was being abused and I had no power. I was 11 years old and an adult man was telling me what to do and, taking from me what I didn't even know I had, as I was becoming a woman. And I was unaware. I was really unaware of what I was sacrificing. And my parents were arrested and my family was split apart. I was put in a foster home. My sister was as well. And ultimately, when our family did come back together, we ended up moving. We ended up leaving the state. And that DARE officer, he ended up in a relationship with a high school girl who got pregnant with his child. And I couldn't understand any of that going on. I was 11, and it really became this foundational question for me of how do we engage in relationships with power? And for me, as a woman, how do I engage with men in power, and where do they see my usefulness? And it caused me a tremendous amount of, later life personal choices that I continued to make based on that. I don't have any blame. I have a lot of accountability for my own low character choices and moments in life. But I do think, one of the most foundational experiences I had of trust at a very young age as a woman was a predatory relationship with an adult when I was 11.
Oh, yeah, you explained it so well. Do you feel like that maybe there was a spirit guides with you and saying, okay, you need to have these, what from the outside are really awful experiences, and they're going to break you down to the core and almost destroy you. And then we're going to give you an instant, a vision of what could be.
Yeah.
And because of all that, you're going to become something so much better.
I just believe so much that my life has been full of divinity in interesting ways and non-traditional, religious ways. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about truly spiritually divine experiences where talking just about a pretty difficult early childhood that I had. I so deeply believe that prepared me for this terrible predatory experience that I had as a, in between years of becoming a woman, which then prepared me for some of these other experiences. And I've always been able to sort of look back with gratitude. And it is like, the portal opens up for a millisecond here and there and just says like, you're on the right path. And I remember, growing up on the Southern Ute Indian Reservation, I was exposed to the culture and the belief system of the Ute tribe. And there was some just really interesting phrasing and interconnectedness with the natural world that I really was often very curious about. And one of the things I loved that we were taught when we were very little was that deja vu, the experience of deja vu, was your like ancestors showing you that you are on the right path. And so they're making your life feel familiar to you. So you know that you are in fact on the right path. And I've always had these intense bouts of deja vu, which also like scientists say is a seizure. So I'm like, maybe I'm just having brain seizures, but I'll have bouts of it. And it's always been around really transitional times in my life where I'm pretty unsure of what's happening. And I feel really, unanchored in my place and unsure of myself. And I'll get deja vu a lot during that. And I like to think, I guess, that, there is that access to somebody tapping me on the shoulder and saying, you're on the right path. You're on the right course.
I really would love it if you could just break down a little bit, getting to the summit without oxygen, without bottled oxygen in 2016. Honestly, I've been you and I have been talking about doing an interview about it for a year, and I get it, things happen, but give me the Cliff Notes version of it, because people don't know how hard it is to do anything without oxygen up there, and you did it for days and days and days and nailed it.
Yeah.
And you had
Yeah.
a bit of like a good partner with you that day
Really
too.
good partner.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I often say, and it just, the words carry no weight to what it means, but everything has to go perfectly. Because if one tiny thing that is I always think about an annoyance is an emergency when you don't have supplemental oxygen. What is an annoyance with oxygen on is an emergency without it. And so the easiest way, I think, for the layperson who's never been at altitudes like this, has never experienced what it feels like, is to think about time, because we all understand time. So, at the South Col at 8,000 meters on, the Nepal side of Everest, getting out of my tent, putting on my boots and crampons in the middle of the night to start climbing, that whole ordeal could take about 30 minutes, which is already quite a long time. But you have oxygen on. It's just kind of cumbersome. You've got more stuff to deal with, but you're just breathing the oxygen. You're putting on your boots. You're kind of resting. You're doing it. To put on boots and crampons without oxygen at the high camp on the north side took almost 2 hours. So
Oh,
think about this activity, and that's not with any luxury of any other activities. That's just every movement takes five. For me, I can speak about my experience of climbing, and I am not, it's really important for people to know, and I'm not like baiting people to compliment me, but I am physiologically absolutely average in every way. So I don't have a naturally high VO2 max. I don't have like a bigger lung to body ratio. I don't have any physiological advantages over an average person. I do have a high tolerance for discomfort, and also a really gentle touch on my discomfort dial. And so if I want to hear my own discomfort, I can turn that shit up really loud, and usually I'll go on like a long drive with loud music and just be in it. If I want to turn that down, I'm a 11-year-old who's being taken advantage of by an adult man in a predatory relationship. I can turn that discomfort dial all the way down and get through life. And so I have a really deft hand on that dial, and that was really helpful with climbing without oxygen. But it was, a perfect alchemy, and I talk about it in the book of the way that I felt in the moment, that season leading up to it. I'd done so many things differently. I lied to the media and I said I wasn't returning to Everest. And I did that because I wanted to be really clear to myself that I wasn't seeking validation. I wasn't just seeking somebody clapping for me and saying, good job, Melissa's doing it again. I also had started to hear whispers from my peers and people I knew and loved and respected that they were saying I couldn't do it. And so I knew if I was putting it out there that I was going to try, I would open myself to receiving that energy, and I didn't want that energy. So I just kept my mouth shut. I said I was focusing on something else, and I went dark off the internet, which was lovely, and really just was present and asked myself every day, like, what am I moving towards? What is my goal here? And I had good days and I had terrible days. And previously, those terrible days might have ruined my whole season. And I might have leaned into, I cannot do this. This is impossible for me. And I did go there in my mind, but I then regained the strength and the healing that I had put so much work into, of saying life is about good days and bad days. You're not going to you can't choose when it's coming. So you be resilient. And resilience is the idea of getting back up and continuing on thoughtfully, not just in the face of I'll die for this, because I wasn't willing to die for it. But I also, more so than people probably can understand, was very acutely aware of that possibility. I'd been facing death on such a large scale for the preceding 9 years. And I knew what the consequences were, but I felt really called to doing this and doing it in my way. And so I didn't have any supplemental oxygen with me, so I couldn't get to the summit if I wanted to with oxygen. So the only way I was going to do this was without oxygen or not do it at all. I had an amazing and supportive partner who, really knew how to push me forward, which is what I needed, because the problem for me was not that I was going to, push myself too hard and risk my life. It was going to be that I was going to turn around before I was ready, that I wasn't going to dig all the way into the well of true reserves that I had. And something happened where the day that we left for our summit push up high, it was like I'd been wrapped with really tight rubber bands my whole life, and they just came off. And I could move with this incredible grace and freedom. And it was like I felt, we talk a little bit about the divinity of it all, but it's like I felt a little bit like I was being like carried there in many ways. And I'm sure that was also oxygen deprivation. And just
Yeah, that's hallucinating. It's called.
yeah, people, I always say, like, some people just do a lot of drugs to kill their brain cells. And I like to just go, there's probably far more fun ways to feel that bad. But I just knew in my heart that like I was here for the right reasons for me and it was going to work. And, and then we got to the summit and I felt this incredible pressure of, Francys Arsentiev had got there, 18 years before with her husband, almost on the same day, 18 years prior. And I just had my death in front of me. I had everything to lose in front of me. And I knew how serious it was. And I knew that we weren't there. We didn't arrive. That was the true halfway. And that cliche is really true. And, then it turns out the descent down to advanced base camp was really arduous and took a lot longer than I had ever imagined because hours out stack on top of each other and, death is courting you. You can pretend that climbing Everest without supplemental oxygen is, perfectly safe and fine and, people can survive up there, but they can't survive for very long. And you are really flirting with, the true consequences of that. And I stayed very aware of that the whole time. I never took that for granted. And, ultimately we safely descended and came down and, incredibly proud of the way that we did it. We did it in the way that felt really right. And I'm so grateful, I have to say. The first time I intended to try to climb without supplemental oxygen was the second time on Everest for me in 2009 when I was 24 years old. And
crazy.
Thank the like goddesses in the sky that I did not get to the summit without oxygen that year because it would mean nothing. It would mean nothing. And I know nobody who's trying something hard wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that like the toil, the failure makes it richer, but like it really, really does. Like I believe intensely in right timing. And for me, I had to go through so much. I had to go through growing, learning, my own failures, some really intense self-reflection and hard truth, and begin the process of healing to be even capable of, taking in all I needed to take in to be successful for me. It ends with this. I am a person who is on a journey of healing those terrible wounds. And, at the end of the book, you get this incredible sense of possibility for us all, because you may have zero interest in climbing Everest. You may have even less interest in why anybody would climb Everest without oxygen. You may have a lot of opinions about why the stupidity of people doing that. But I can tell you that, for me, that was the place I had to go to really arrive as myself. And I think we all are on a journey like that in our own space and ways. And that journey is going to look familiar to any reader, whether, they just have any interest in Everest or not.
Melissa and I spoke for another 30 minutes, which I will include in my podcast episode in the happiness quotient. Important in that discussion was her telling me about obligation she feels toward the people and the culture of the Everest region. She founded with close friend David Morton the Juniper Fund, and I have an interview with David Morton about the Juniper Fund. It helps families who have lost a mountain worker working in the mountains, and it provides them with grants and opportunities to give them a new means of making a living and supporting the family after that person, usually a male, has died working in the mountains. 70 people they've helped so far since they founded the Juniper Fund. I'll have a link to that interview with David Morton as well as to the Juniper Fund, and I'll be releasing that portion of my interview with Melissa later here, so stay tuned for that. The book is Enough: Climbing Toward a True Self on Mount Everest. Thank you, Melissa Arnot Reid, for taking the time to share about your inner journey. My friends, do a good deed. Don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you.